aliveness is dangerous because when people become fully alive, they stop tolerating what isn't true, and that threatens everything built on their unconscious compliance. Most people think aliveness, vitality, energy is just something pleasant, something nice, something inconsequential, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Aliveness is the most potent and dangerous force there is. Because the moment one becomes fully alive, they begin to see clearly. They see which parts of their life are real and which parts were built out of adaptation. They see where they've been complying, where they've been performing, where they've been living inside structures that were never truly theirs. We've become so disconnected from aliveness that we've lost the ability to access it. But it's never left us. When you wake up and feel the sun on your skin, when you're fully immersed in a creative project, when you play with your puppy, when you're just there, not thinking about the moment at all, just fully present, fully immersed, laughing, moving, speaking freely, existing without resistance. In those moments, there's no effort, no performance, no control, just pure life. Those moments seem unimportant, but they signal something essential. In those moments, you become less willing to tolerate what diminishes you, or less willing to tolerate remaining inside what is false, or to betray yourself to preserve stability, to make others happy. And that's precisely why aliveness is dangerous, because once it emerges, once you pay attention, you cannot ignore it, whether you're ready for it or not. Most people don't suppress aliveness consciously. They suppress it because their identity depends on it. Identity is not who we are. Identity is who we had to become to survive. And it's the set of adaptations we've constructed to remain safe, remain accepted, functional, predictable. From a very early age, we begin learning which parts of ourselves are acceptable and which parts are not. We learn which emotions can be expressed freely and which ones must be contained, which impulses are welcomed and which ones create friction, which ways of being allow us to remain connected and which ones threaten stability. Over time, we begin shaping ourselves accordingly. Not consciously, most of the time, this is a subtle and insidious process. We become someone who can function inside the world we've been given. People who are accepted and understood, people who don't create friction, people who belong. And eventually, this adaptation becomes identity. We begin confusing it for who we truly are. It's what Carl Jung called the persona, the version of ourselves we construct to function in society. A necessary adaptation, but not who we truly are. The philosopher Kierkegaard described the exact same thing when he wrote that most people live in a state of unconscious selfhood, shaped by the world, their external reality, but disconnected from their true nature. Pirandello, the famous Italian writer and playwright, revealed this with extraordinary clarity in his novels and plays, that the person we believe ourselves to be is often nothing more than a role, like a character in a play. This persona, this character, the identity you've built to survive, is not the same thing as aliveness. Identity is constructed, aliveness is not. Identity is shaped by memory, conditioning, and repetition, Aliveness exists only in the present. Aliveness is spontaneous, responsive, uncontrolled. It does not ask permission from the structures you built in the past. It often disrupts those very structures. And this is where the danger begins. Because when aliveness increases, our perception sharpens. You begin to notice things that previously felt normal and now feel out of sync. Ways of speaking that don't feel true anymore. Ways of being that feel rehearsed. Ways of existing that feel subtly misaligned. The behaviors that once allowed you to remain safe begin to feel artificial. Not because they stopped working, but because you can now see them clearly. You can feel the distance between who you are inside, your true essence, and who you've been performing. And this creates enormous instability because identity, your sense of self, the persona, depends on continuity. It depends on repetition. It depends on us remaining the same person we were yesterday. But one morning we wake up and we're just different. Aliveness has disrupted the continuity. It has introduced new perception, new responses, new possibilities. And as this happens, the identity you built begins to lose its structural integrity. Sometimes all at once, and it can be quite disruptive, and sometimes gradually, which is a much smoother, even though painful process. Either way, it's inevitable. This is why people often feel destabilized when they begin to come alive and why they resist it. And we all do it. Because letting go of what you've known is scary as hell. The structures that organize your behavior no longer feel solid, and that's profoundly destabilizing. And most people interpret this disruption as danger. They assume something is breaking, something is wrong, something must be corrected one way or another. So they suppress aliveness. They return to familiar patterns out of fear because they want life to remain predictable and coherent. They want life to remain controlled. And this suppression is rarely conscious, I might say. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like relief. It feels like a return to balance. It soothes the nervous system, a return to normalcy. But what's actually happening is a structural loss. Aliveness being constrained again to preserve identity stability. Because identity provides psychological and sometimes even physical safety. And aliveness, by its very nature, disrupts that safety. That's why people self sabotage all the time. That's why people don't go after their dreams. Because aliveness, its goal is not to preserve what was constructed. Its goal is not to preserve what is artificial. Aliveness reveals what is real. And anything built on adaptation rather than truth cannot remain fully intact in its presence. Aliveness is not just dangerous psychologically to the individual, it's dangerous to society too. Because modern society depends on people's predictability. Predictable people are stable. They behave in expected ways. They remain inside predefined roles. They move along approved trajectories. They don't disrupt systems, Not at all. If anything, they reinforce them. A predictable person is easy to control because they show up when expected, they comply with the pace that is required, they tolerate what is intolerable as long as it remains normal. And this is not necessarily even a moral accusation, it's just a structural observation. Modern life is built around coordination. Schedules, institutions, roles, metrics, timetables, social norms. And you see this everywhere. You see this in schools where originality is subordinate to compliance. You see this in professional life where being dependable often means suppressing what you truly feel. You see this in relationships where people marry for convenience instead of joy. Even online, where entire systems and algorithms are designed to reinforce who you have been, not who you are becoming. For these structures to function at scale, human beings must remain, above all, legible, stable, and controllable. Now, here's the problem though. A person who becomes fully alive becomes less predictable, less submissive to direction, and not necessarily because they become rebellious, they can be, but because they stop living primarily through conditioning. They begin responding directly to reality. There's no gap anymore between them and reality itself, and reality is alive, it is responsive. Aliveness has its own intelligence. It moves towards what is true, what is vital, what is aligned, often long before the mind can justify it. Once you begin living from that level, you become way harder to stabilize, harder to categorize, harder to pin down. Because when you're fully alive, certain things become impossible. Suddenly, you cannot breathe inside environments that suppress you, like your soul-sucking job or a marriage that died a long time ago. What is the price that you're paying? You cannot pursue goals anymore that were never truly yours. And not because you've become lazy all of a sudden, but because the goals feel dead. You stop performing the version of yourself that made everyone else comfortable, and you start speaking the truth instead, and you become less available for relationships that drain you. Again, this is not necessarily an act of rebellion, it's an act of alignment. And alignment is disruptive because systems, schools, corporations, the economy, social media do not run on alignment. Systems run on participation, on people doing what is expected, on people continuing the pattern, and not because it is true, it rarely is, but because it makes everything work. And this is exactly why aliveness is structurally disruptive, because systems depend on your unconscious participation and not your conscious alignment. They depend on you moving through life in a semi-sedated state, a compliant state, where you're not necessarily unhappy, you're just disconnected, you're numb. Numb enough to be stable, numb enough to remain manageable, disengaged enough to not question the entire architecture you're living inside. So, suppression of aliveness becomes normalized, not as a conspiracy, but as a structural necessity. And the system does it automatically because it rewards whatever allows it to keep functioning. So deadening becomes adaptive, predictability becomes rewarded, and aliveness becomes pathologized. Think about it. The person who is numb is called mature. The person who's compliant is called responsible. The person who never deviates from the script is called stable. But the person who's alive, the person who changes, who feels too much, who can't tolerate lies, who refuses to keep betraying themselves, the person who goes after her dreams, that person is called unrealistic, too intense, too sensitive, too much. She's often shunned and even pathologized. In the Victorian era, they conveniently called her hysteric. There's no greater paradox in modern life. We have built a civilization where the most human thing in you, your aliveness, is treated as a problem to manage. So people learn very early, and this is the saddest thing, to regulate themselves downward. They learn to become legible, to become appropriate, to become functional, to become predictable. They learn to edit their vitality, to compress their truth, to shrink their perception. Because the cost of being fully alive is inevitably social friction. It is inconvenience, it is disruption. And most people would rather be accepted than feel alive. Not because they're weak, but because the system makes acceptance feel like survival. And this is why aliveness is dangerous for the status quo. Because once enough people become fully alive, they stop consenting to what is false. They stop participating in what is dead. They stop building their entire lives around what is predictable but empty. And systems cannot survive that shift unchanged. They must either evolve or tighten control. And that is the real reason so much of modern life feels like subtle suffocation. It is not only that you're disconnected from yourself, it is that you're living inside structures that require you to stay disengaged in order to remain stable. And once you see that, you start to understand something incredibly uncomfortable. Your malaise, your restlessness is not just personal, it's civilizational. Your numbness is not just biochemical, it's adaptive. And your longing for aliveness is not a nice desire, it's a non-negotiable that also happens to be a threat to everything built on your unconscious compliance. This is why most people, I'm sure many of the listeners too, sense aliveness, but do not allow it fully. Not because they don't want it, but because they sense its consequences. Aliveness reorganizes your life. It dismantles what was built on unconscious adaptation. It exposes what you've been tolerating. It reveals where you've been complying, where you've been performing, where you've been living inside structures that were never truly yours. And once you see that clearly, you can no longer pretend not to see it. You can no longer fully return to unconsciousness. You can try, your ego probably would really like that, but you can't return there because perception itself has changed. Aliveness sharpens your relationship to reality. It makes truth perceptible. And truth is inherently destabilizing. It dissolves what was never aligned with you to begin with. That's why people suppress it, why they postpone it, why they're never ready for it, why they distract themselves from it in all sorts of ways. Their entire lives, people are afraid to truly live because allowing aliveness means allowing change. And change threatens everything that was built to keep life stable. Aliveness in this sense is dangerous, very dangerous, but it's not destructive. On the contrary, it's clarifying. It does not destroy what is real. It only dissolves the illusions, what was constructed in its absence. Aliveness is never lost. It's always there. It's only suppressed. It has been waiting beneath everything you've built to survive. And the danger was never aliveness itself. The danger was always what it reveals. If what I'm saying resonates with you, it's likely because something in you already recognizes it. And not so much intellectually, of course, you understand it cognitively, you're smart, but you recognize it somatically. Something inside of you moves. Because aliveness does not need to be taught, it needs to be remembered. If you want to explore this further, subscribe to this channel. This is where I articulate these ideas more deeply, not as self-help, but as a philosophy of being fully alive in the modern world. And if you want to go deeper, join my newsletter. That's where I share ideas, writings, and reflections that I don't publish anywhere else. The link is in the description below. Your aliveness is not the problem. It never was.